Welcome to In the Reads, the podcast of San Jose State University's Read Magazine, California's oldest literary journal. My name is Collin Bartolomei, and in this episode, I'll be speaking with Alice Hatcher, winner of Read Magazine issue 157's John Steinbeck Award for Fiction, about her short story, Caesura. Alice Hatcher is a graduate of the University of Michigan and a former academic historian turned essayist, novelist, and poet. Her 2018 debut novel, The Wonder That Was Ours, won the 2017 Dezenk Books Prize for Fiction, and she's published short stories, essays, and poetry across numerous journals, including the Masters Review, Bellevue Literary Review, and Alaska Quarterly Review, just to name a few. Alice's short story was chosen from 3 finalists by her celebrity guest judge, Collin Winnette, who calls the work a meditative and contemplative piece that he read, quote, with the same curiosity and eagerness one might bring to a thriller. Good afternoon, Alice. It is good to see you and talk to you, although the people at home won't be seeing you, but it's good to talk to you nonetheless. So my first question, just to start off, is, just to get into more questions specifically about your story, Caesura. Why Caesura? And, how did this concept emerge? I mean, just the title in general, it's something I've never heard before.
Yeah, it's an odd word. Most people struggle with it. What does it mean? I actually wasn't thinking about it as a title, and I just started thinking about it late one night. I was almost half dreaming and then had to look it up to make sure it thought what I thought it meant. And that just means an interruption or a break in the flow of something. It's usually a term applied to poetry when there's a break in the middle of a line. And the story really is all about breaks and disruptions. It's, I don't know what people will know of the story when they're listening to the podcast, but it's about a woman who is going about her day in the first paragraph or two and shopping and going to an open air market. And she's leading a fairly charmed life when she happens to walk into an open air market that's the target of a suicide bombing, a mass suicide bombing, which causes untold damage. She survives, wakes up in a hospital with very limited memory because of head trauma, very little memory of her former life, or even the fact that there's a war going on. And so it's really about this profound disruption in what seems to be an ordinary life. And then that theme carries through in the story, I thought, because, she wakes up in this hospital, she finds out her face has been reconstructed, and she keeps asking the nurses to show her a mirror so she can see what she looks like. And the nurses won't show her a mirror because they don't want her upset by the extent of her injuries. So one night she sneaks out of the hospital ward and starts looking around the hospital, trying to find a bathroom or any mirror she can because she's desperate to see herself. And she thinks, too, that looking into her own eyes is going to trigger some memories of her past and who she was. She doesn't even know if she had a family. And she wasn't brought in with ID. So she literally is starting from ground zero and trying to find a mirror. And instead of finding a mirror, she finds another woman who is also bandaged heavily, probably based on some scarring on her face, also been reconstructed. I mean, almost a mirror image of her, herself. And she starts talking to the woman and piecing together things that happened. And they both together try and sort out where they are, what's going on, what has happened to them. And so, and then I'll lead up, back to your question again. In the course of their conversation, she notices on the woman's arm a trace of a tattoo that triggers a memory. She has her first fleeting memory, like, wait, I saw this woman before, I've seen her before. And she has a flash of being in that open air market, and this woman with this tattoo detonating a bomb right next to her, and the bomb doesn't go off, but others do. So suddenly she's just overcome with this terror and this hatred and this fear in the presence of this woman. But then these fragmentary memories keep fading away. She's an amnesiac. So, I mean, the idea of Caesura really was about these moments of peace. I mean, not peace in her case, but these moments of kind of quiet, inner quiet, and struggle certainly to figure out who she is, but then being interrupted by these very intrusive memories and intrusive thoughts that trigger a great deal of of angst. And so it's really, this whole story is about a seesaw between memory and, you know, memories that shape us, and then moments of amnesia, which, you know, are the closest thing this woman can get to peace. So it's a story about interruptions and whipsawing. And it was a very, challenging story to write. And the title was a bit odd. People always ask me, what does it mean? So it really was, that would seem like the right title, because it was about trying to find a detente with somebody else and with your own past too. We'll see. We'll see.
Yeah, I think you captured it perfectly. And I am curious, like it sounds to me that the word or the title is what really started this concept. Is that correct?
Yeah, once I had the title, I was sketching out the story. I just kind of done the outline. That's how I work. I just kind of throw down an outline, and it's usually very rough. Then I start, I guess like a visual artist, I start filling in bits and then start painting on the canvas. But I was very early in the process, and that was the idea that haunted me, just this rupture, this very sharp rupture in somebody's life, and how somebody then processes something really traumatic, without letting themselves become without being overcome by hatred or whatnot, because she meets this woman in the hospital and figures out pretty much who it is. And it's how she then relates to this woman, knowing what happened, and that they've both been terribly injured, and that really they're both victims in their own different ways of what happened. Um, so it was a challenging story to write, but yeah, Caesura was at the heart of it, or Caesura, I should say. And once that word got embedded in my mind, it really shaped the way the story evolved. So yeah, it's a haunting concept for me.
Absolutely. I'm very curious what your process is like in terms, you mentioned your outlining process a bit, but in terms of research, what level of research do you take into account when constructing something like this that is, more non-fictional?
Well, I mean, just as an aside, I used to be a historian in a former life. I really started writing fiction late in life at 40 years old, shocking. But I used to teach modern European history, and my work, whether it was my first novel or other things I've done, stories, have all been really influenced by a lot of what I used to study and teach as a professor. And my friends make fun of me, my writers' friends. I'll spend weeks reading 50 books before even sit down and write a short story. So that often factors in, although with this story, and maybe it's time for a little trigger warning, it emerged from something more closer to home. I actually didn't do a single shred of research for this story, though it was based on something very real. And I feel it's important to tell this story because it contextualizes a lot. It might set the stage for the rest of our conversation. But this story came out of my attempt to really work through something that happened to me when I was 17 years old. And it's a weird story. And again, it's only because I'm now in my 50s I can tell this story, and because I've done a lot of work around it. But I was at a party, and it was close to the end of my senior year, and I met a woman who, she was interesting. We talked. She said at the end of the, party, like, oh, we should hang out sometime. And I thought that's great. So the next weekend we met, and we spent the afternoon just wandering around. I remember all these places very vividly, wherever you hang out when you're 17. And she was telling me some very disturbing stories about herself. And I remember thinking, when you're 17, you think that's kind of normal. Like, as an adult now, I'd be like, whoa, somebody's telling me something really a little too intense, for just having met them. But at the time I was 17, and I think, you can confuse those kinds of stories for, real intimacy, or you're excited to be somebody's confidant or whatever. And at the end of the afternoon, we got into her car, and it was some sports car. She was one of the rich kids in school. And so I guess I was a little starstruck as well. And we were halfway home, and we were on this winding country road, and I suddenly realized we're going really fast. And I looked over at the speedometer, and she had the needle buried at 95, and then jerked the wheel and headed us straight for some trees. And I was knocked unconscious, and I don't want to horrify people with the details, but I spent some time in a coma, and it really derailed my life in a lot of ways. And I spent a long time recovering from that accident. And just as an eerie thing, so you can see where the story comes from, I woke up in the hospital and she was badly injured too. And came up to my hospital room unexpectedly one day, in her hospital gown and wheeling her IV. And it was a very, very startling and unnerving sight. And all I could say to her is, what happened and why did you do it? Because I remember looking at her and saying, you need to slow down. And she sped up and headed us right. It was obviously intentionally done. And she said, God told me to do it. And I had to live with that. And that was, our conversation was very short. I was shocked. I was in a hospital bed. I was hooked up to a million things. And that was that. She wandered out and I never saw her again. And I just tell the story because Caesura is obviously the most abstracted version of that incident. And I wrote, Caesura partly to work through that and to kind of explore issues of forgiveness. Like, how do you forgive somebody who is committed an unspeakable thing and tried to harm you? And it took me, I would say, 30 years, partly because it really did derail my life in a lot of ways, and in ways that, you can look back and you can regret things, and I've moved on. But it took this. I mean, I was sitting around with my husband one day, and I just said, I'd just been reminded of something that took me back to that time in my life. And I was telling him about it, and I was telling him how angry I'd been and how angry even I still was sometimes. And this was like, 15 years ago. And he looked at me and he said, she was 17 years old. And it was really a game changer for me, him saying that. He said, she was 17, she's probably a different person now. Because I was saying things like, if I ever met her, I don't know what I would do, and I've never gone back to Chicago where this happened. I've never encountered her again, but I was always really wary. Like, what if I ever see her again? What would I say? How would I react? But then thinking about her as a 17-year-old and thinking about her as somebody who might have changed, and thinking about her as much as I could as a person who had struggled with severe mental illness, as it turns out, and I didn't know that at the time, just allowed me to see her as a different kind of person. So this was really, Caesura was a story that allowed me to explore these issues in a very abstract way. So it came out of a very real situation, to answer your question. There was no research, but there was a lot of material there. And I think I wrote about it in a very abstract way because it was the only way for me to get at that. I wasn't about to sit down and relive that, but I could write about it in the context of this very abstract environment that appears in the story. So
That's amazing that your writing in many ways is, sort of a therapeutic experience for you, being able to work through, you know, incredible trauma and being able to put it to the page and share it with the world, the power of storytelling and as a kind of healing.
yeah, yeah, no, it was really a good thing to do. I'm glad I did it. And it was a very difficult story to write. I must have written 20,000 drafts of this, which I tend to do anyway with most of my stories, but maybe this more than any story. I wrote it in the past tense, I wrote it in the present tense. It had a 20,000 word version, it had a 2,000 word version, and the 5,000 word version I thought did the best job of getting to the themes without overwhelming or overdoing it. So no, it was a very healing thing. And so that's why I have a kind of special place in my heart for this story as well. It's a hard story. There's no doubt. It's a very dark story.
Yeah. And every moment in the story flows so well. It doesn't feel like a single sentence, a single word is wasted. It all just flows together in one continuous break in the life of one person.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I guess we've talked about this already, but in terms of the, break or interruption, style of this story, what made you use so many parentheticals in your writing here?
Yeah, yeah. There's a great question, and it just sort of it kind of came naturally, maybe because when I was revisiting some of this dark material, it was it was hard for me to process. So there are times when I found my own thoughts kind of spiraling and doing what they do in the story. these asides, whenever you're processing something that emotional, there's so many opportunities to go into the weeds, to start digressing. So that was some of it. In terms of, maybe this goes back to the Caesura, the idea, I mean, there are moments in almost everybody's life where things come down to that before and after, and life changes, and it's never going to be the same again. And it's hard for people to talk about those moments without the pauses, without the kind of qualifying, without the kind of, well, what I really mean. Um, and I was thinking about, one of the examples would be like 9/11, that we all went through that. I mean, people have such vivid memories of just that rupture, and I myself, I remember it was such a sunny day, and the sky was clear, and it happened out of nowhere. And our lives just were irrevocably changed. It was such a defining moment. And I think it's so hard for people to process those kinds of ruptures that are so much without, like I said, all these digressions. And then the second thing is, again, it is like, that's the nature of processing trauma, when you're so close to it. It's interesting that I wrote the story in the present ultimately because I wanted to get as close to her experience as possible. If I'd had this kind of detached third person narrator looking back over the years like I am now, it wouldn't probably have been a very interesting story because it would have been a different kind of story. We'll put it that way. But I wanted to capture that very precise feeling of being angry and then forgetting and wanting to forget and then going back to being very immersed in the situation. And so the parentheticals were about that struggle. It was, she'll be saying something, the point of view character would be saying something, and then pausing and thinking, but no, what I really feel is this. No, but wait, I want to forgive her. Parentheses, no, but she tried to kill me. And it was that whipsaw. And then the third reason I think is just more, you know, embarrassing fangirl stuff, but not embarrassing. I was reading a lot of Shirley Jackson at the time, and she's so well known for The Haunting of Hill House, but my favorite Shirley Jackson novel is actually Hangs a Man, which is about a woman going to a boarding school where she experiences a certain mental disintegration. She just doesn't handle the transition to boarding school very well for a variety of reasons. And Shirley Jackson uses punctuation to capture her state of mind, whether it's dashes, semicolons, you know, all sorts of bizarre parentheticals too. And I have to admit, I mean, it's kind of that thing. Okay, I got to be honest about the intellectual genealogy here, and it all goes back to Shirley Jackson. I just happened to be reading her at the time, and I adore her writing. And just started off thinking, oh, I'll experiment with this, and it was just so catchy to me. So, people who love Shirley Jackson will say, oh yeah, she ripped her off. And yes, I mean, I'll tip my hat to Shirley Jackson and fully admit that she was really a huge influence here.
That's great. When I was first reading it, I found it a bit jarring actually seeing all those parentheticals, but on my second and on third readings, I realized it sort of felt, and I think you sort of mentioned this, that it's almost like a flow of consciousness or, the way the mind works, our thought processes, they're not exactly linear. They go off on tangents. They constantly are shifting. So I thought it was really clever in that way, how they sort of worked to show that same sort of process of thought.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you. No, it was a hard thing, and I wouldn't recommend, everybody to try it at home, but I certainly recommend reading Shirley Jackson's Hangs a Man.
You've mentioned a lot of the things I've been thinking about already, but the significance of mirrors and reflections in this story, how would you describe that motif in and how it relates and mirrors the protagonist's own, internal conflicts?
Yeah, that was one of those I'm thinking about this question. It was one of these things that in the story sort of just came up from the depths of, whatever subconsciousness. It's not that I thought about it too much, but as I'm thinking about it now, I mean, I've always been fascinated by mirrors, that we look into them every single day. Every minute it seems of every day we're passing a mirror. This is a country, I mean, everywhere, basically at this point. But certainly I feel like, it's hard to walk 2 feet in this country without passing a mirror and looking at your face and analyzing your face and kind of in that quick flash telling yourself your life story, or that's me, I have this color eyes, I have this color hair, this is my race, this is my gender. We're constantly telling ourselves these little mini autobiographies every time we look in a mirror. And I wanted to explore in the story, I guess, what happens to this woman when she doesn't have access to mirrors. Her face is not her own anymore. She's totally alienated from her body, and she has to recreate a sense of herself. And there's this longing for her to look in a mirror. I want to see my own eyes. If I look into my own eyes, I'll trigger memories. I'll have more of a sense of my humanity. I'll be able to feel whole again if I look into my own eyes, because she's tortured by this fact that the nurses in the hospital won't show her own face, to the point where she's trying to look into a spoon. She's trying to look into a metal tray. She's just desperate to see her own face, but she can't. And that leads to her walking around the hospital. And ultimately in the story, there's that moment when she and the bomber, who doesn't know she's a bomber, and the victim isn't sure she's a bomber, realize that they've both had the same reconstructive surgery, and that they're looking into the mirror in a sense when they look at each other, which is eerie because they're mortal enemies. On the outside of the hospital in their former lives, they were mortal enemies. But here they are in the hospital, both just shattered, trying to recover, and they're looking into each other's eyes and trying to recognize each other. And in my story, it just so happens that, they've had similar surgeries. So they start, as feeling each other's faces and looking at each other and trying to really see themselves in somebody else rather than by looking into a mirror. And it's a big step. And it was just, for me, working on a kind of a deeper level again about seeing somebody else's humanity and becoming more human yourself by recognizing somebody else's humanity. I mean, it is about that process of forgiveness when you can look at somebody again who hurt you terribly and look at them in the eyes, or at least think about them and see their humanity, and then in a sense become more conscious of your own humanity. And I don't know, it's funny because, like I said, we're so obsessed with mirrors and selfies and branding ourselves and this, that, and the other. And I know I sound like an old fart saying that, but it's it's kind of true. And I did an experiment once, and I just covered, this sounds totally insane, but I just covered all the mirrors in my house, and I made a point of not looking in the mirrors. This is while I was writing the story, just to see how it would feel. And it is kind of unnerving. You start to get obsessed. Well, I'm sure I look like crap today. What am I? Oh my God, I don't even know if I look like crap. And it really started to get to me. And I thought it was fascinating. I'd suggest everyone should do it once, and see what it feels like.
Yeah, and I think there's something interesting too about mirrors and the fact that they don't actually show us, how we look to everyone else too. So it's
Mhm.
having that
Absolutely.
other person to be the mirror image and to look back at them and sort of see themselves in the other person, I think is a sort of beautiful concept. And there's so
Yeah, no,
much.
I love what you've just said. I absolutely love it. I'm going to write this down because it's true. We can stare at our own gobs all we want for years on end, but and people who have really been in love or love somebody beyond that, love somebody, we have all had that best friend, that lover, that husband or wife or spouse, whatever person in our life who tells us things we can't realize about ourselves. And I know for me, it's, my spouse who routinely reminds me of, you know, things about myself that I don't even think I could know, and it's a beautiful thing. And I think everybody should experience that. Hopefully everybody can in their lives, when you trust somebody and love somebody so much that that there's some things about yourself that they might actually know better, and that's a really weird feeling, and it's incredible. So I'm so glad you said that, because that's essentially what the story's trying to get to.
Yeah. And I mean, just these two, for the most part, strangers. I mean, honestly, yeah, actually strangers, to have that sort of connection through their own loss of their perceived identity, I think is
Yeah.
interesting too. And, a sort of reclaiming identity through each other also, I am you and you are me and we are each other. But One of the things I was most impressed about with your writing was just your style and your visual clarity and the robustness of your language. And actually, I want to mention Collin Winnette here. I earlier
Yeah.
I was looking for a quote from him about your piece, and I found one that I think really speaks to your writing. He described it as beautiful and crisp, and he likened it to a sort of performance of a great magic trick that allows you to feel completely immersed in the world. And I completely agree with that. You're the way you're able to draw attention with detail, even the smallest things here and there, like the spoon or something like that, it really just draws the reader into the scene with a really striking clarity. And I thought it was brilliant. With that in mind, there is a question here. What made you write so clearly for such a relatively ambiguous story, whether it be from, the main protagonist's identity, the setting in general, and even the ending?
Mhm. Yeah, I'm so one grateful that you said that, and thank you. It's so kind, and Colin Winnette as well. It's so kind of him to say that. I have just started teaching creative writing for the first time in my life, and I'm always telling students, ground things in the details. That's how you get your reader. You just it's essential and engage every sense, and it's the bottom line. So basic, but it's so easy to forget. And I always worry, God, am I just teaching people what I'm not doing myself? I really try to, and I think I just kind of do a meditative exercise whenever I write anything. I suggest people do this all the time. I mean, I literally just sit down and I'll, close my eyes and just try and be as present as I can with the setting and try and channel it as much as I can. And it sounds kooky and new age, and some of the students, react like, oh, geez, there she goes again. But, I'll just really say meditate on the scene. When you're doing your dialogue, read it, like act it out. Just walk around your room, act it out, physically embody it. And I think it really helps a lot. And there's been, so much research about the connection between the body and our emotions and our mood. So I'll say, if you're writing about somebody who's tense, literally just clench up your fists and throw your shoulders forward and tense up, because it will affect your mood and the way you're thinking about a subject. If you're trying to relax and engage with that, just throw back your shoulders and take a deep breath, and you can really start to be present with emotions in a different way. Visualizing is important. I don't know, if I have anything rational to say about how to do that. But it's something that I've just always found really important, just to spend as much time seeing the scene. And it's like world building in science fiction. It can be totally fantastical. This place isn't real. I just said it's a mountainous region. It's a hospital. You don't know where the hospital is. The generator's flickering. It's kind of everything's on the fritz in this hospital, but you don't know much about it, but just make that hospital real. And that's what I say to anybody. It doesn't matter what you're writing about. Science fiction, you can set it on planet Q, but just make sure that you know planet Q as well as you can. And people will go for the ride if you hand them that detail. They'll go on any ride as long as you just give them enough for their imaginations to latch onto. And I just think again, talk about communicating between human beings. I think it was Kurt Vonnegut who said, this is as close as we get to being able to read each other's minds, the act of writing. And I just love that idea. So it's sort of like letting your imagination onto the page so somebody can get to know you. And, anyway, so thank you for your comments. I'm rambling, but it's just, that's the magic of writing for me. That's when I'm in the zone, when I'm just meditating like that.
Yeah, I mean, the devil in the details and all that, it's important to be able to, sort of ground yourself in those finer details in order to really just immerse yourself within a story or a scene. And I think you've done that masterfully here in Caesura. And I really found it interesting, the sort of juxtaposition of, those finer details compared with just the abstract nature of basically everything else.
Yeah, thank you.
So your main protagonist, the woman, it's sort of a really interesting and fascinating conundrum that, this idea of memory and how it relates to identity. Um, Do you think memory is, sort of what makes us who we are? And do you think it's ethically possible to hold someone accountable for actions they have no memory of? Because that I think was a big part of that ending is they don't really know each other, and she, the woman who did it, doesn't really know what she's done. So can she even be held accountable, or should she?
Yeah, that's a tough question, and it's a great question. And certainly one of the questions that haunted me as I was writing the story, for obvious reasons. In terms of memory, I mean, yeah, it's such a huge part, and the historian in me thinks it's not just a huge part individually, but collectively, entire cultures, that they've passed down these memories over the generations, and can really shape people's behavior, how they act, how they perceive themselves. Certainly, our own memories as individuals. I just like to hope and think that our memories and our histories aren't the sum total of who we are. They're important. And as a historian, obviously, I think it was important. It's important for people to know where they came from, not just, in terms of their cultures and their specific, but just as a human race, where have we been and where are we going? And I think we need to get to know ourselves much better that way historically. In terms of, but I like to think it's not the sum total, that people aren't defined entirely by their history, or that history doesn't become so over determining that somebody can say, I mean, I'm just of Irish descent. So, I mean, this is, well, I'm a Catholic, so therefore I'm always going to hate Protestants, or something like this. I mean, that's just ridiculous. And that's what I was trying to write against in the story, that there has to be something more. And in terms of holding people accountable, I mean, this is just a conversation that could go on for hours, but, I struggled with that obviously in my own life. And I've been really interested in questions about, mental illness and crime, and how do you punish people who would do something either under the influence of a drug, or, you know, maybe because of mental illness. I mean, obviously the story and the situation is pretty extreme. The bomber doesn't literally remember that she bombed anybody. She has no idea. Um, and she's as distraught as the victim of her crimes. But we encounter these similar situations, like I said, as we look at our own penal system and how we approach different crimes, especially juvenile crimes. And so what I keep hoping maybe one of the things the story can do is get people to think about that question that you asked. It's a very difficult question. I've had to come to terms with it. I mean, there were times in my life when, like I said, I mean, I was like, I hope I never run into this woman on the street. I like to think I could now and be okay with that. Of course, I might, not be in the greatest mood that day, but I like to think that people can change. And I like to think that people can be driven to extremities by desperate situations, or by ideology, or by all sorts of things, but that there's got to be something underneath it all, beyond our history, beyond what we inherit to make us who we are. And in terms of the responsibility, I mean, I think I tend to believe in reform rather than the kind of punishment maybe that we see in our prison system. I'll put it that way. Simply because I do think we have to believe that people can change, or else there's no reason. We might as well give up and throw in the towel. And I'm not saying, I don't understand the pain of victims. I certainly understand the pain of victims probably as much as anybody else. But I do feel, just from on a personal level, that I could let hatred consume me and a desire for revenge to consume me, or I can, hope to God that people change. And so are people accountable? I mean, of course they're accountable on some level, but, I think it's really always important to kind of look at the possibility of change and also circumstance. So that's all I can say. I mean, everybody's going to have to come to their own place with that.
Yeah, when I was reading your story, that idea came to me of, memory as it relates to accountability, and it reminded me of a short story, a speculative fiction piece by an author, Matthew Baker, called Life Sentence. I don't know if you've read it, but
Yeah.
it sort of tackled this idea of, what if instead of, imprisonment, you
Mhm.
would take away in years the memory of those
Yeah.
people that had
Right.
committed crimes. And I thought it was a very interesting and challenging notion that this idea that memory is so intertwined with our identity and how we view ourselves and our actions of the past and how those affect, our actions in the future. But still, there's an underlying, personality or identity there that isn't ruled by our history, by our memories, that I think, challenges and confuses and makes more complex the question of, is memory, all that makes us?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm certainly not advocate. I mean, that's a fascinating story and I've written it down. I'm going to read that. I don't want to say like, oh, well, if we just shed our memories and, ignored our histories, everything would be great. I mean, I think that's kind of a utopian vision, but it's also a scary vision because there's so much attempt at historical erasure. And it's also easy for me to have that kind of utopian vision as a white person, somebody blah, blah, blah. But I would certainly never say, oh, we just need to get past our histories and move beyond, because that would be utterly insulting to so many people with obviously histories that are still being contested, still being erased. So in any case, it's a great question. And it's something to just keep revisiting, how does history play into our identities and how we interact and our sense of ourselves and justice, our sense of justice. So, it's something to keep thinking about. And I
Yeah.
could keep talking about it forever. So I should.
Yeah, so we'll move on then. What do you hope that people really take away from this story? What do you want them to get from this?
Yeah, I mean, just very simply, I'll keep it short, is just, I mean, to really challenge, I want people to challenge themselves, hopefully, and to think about the limits and the possibilities for empathy and recognizing other people. To really, even when you're feeling hurt, to pause and try and think about what somebody else has gone through. And obviously, like I said, it's been a lifelong challenge for me in regards to what happened to me. I'm not going to pretend it's easier that I'm over it, but certainly it helps to think about the humanity of somebody else. And I'll just say as an aside, there's this kind of movement in certain academic circles right now, and I'm not going to name names. I would love to, but I'm not going to name names. But where people are talking about, how empathy is all kind of a joke. It's an empty word that, liberals like to pat themselves on the back and talk about empathy, that there's this new age contingent that's trying to push empathy, and have really pushed back against it and said it's hollow and that we just need to stop talking about it. And I think that's a really scary position. A lot of these people are kind of, progressive in some ways, but they think it's sort of a hollow platitude. And I get it. Like, people can overuse the word empathy and it can lose some of its meaning. But I mean, these people are saying that we just need to throw it out the window and stop talking about empathy. It's a bunch of BS, because ultimately our histories have determined, things to such a degree that ultimately we're never all going to get along, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not naive about this, but I do think that that kind of that kind of posturing, philosophical posturing, is really dangerous and scary. I think there's some people out there making careers out of conflict. And, it's a really scary thing that people right now at some of our best schools are saying that empathy is a joke and we need to get rid of it. I think it's terrifying. What do we have left? If there's no empathy, we're looking at barbarity. And
Yeah.
I can tell you, we've all been saved by somebody's empathy at some point or another. Somebody saying that person needs help. I know I have just today. Some neighbor helped me with something. So I really want people to think about the difficulties of recognizing other people's humanity. Just identify those hard moments in their own life, and maybe try and think, well, what's going on in the other person's life. Maybe that would get us a long way.
Yeah. That really is a dangerous precedent, like this idea that we should ignore or forget empathy when that really is, I think, what makes us human, our ability to empathize and to see the world from other people's perspectives. And really, that is the point of literature in many ways. And the point of your story that it captures so well is that we need to be able and to try to see things from other people's perspectives and the way life is different for everyone.
Yeah, yeah, and a lot of this kind of argumentation is coming out of English departments. And as you said, empathy is the foundation of art. It's why we write, hopefully. And I don't know where we go without it. So, call me Pollyanna or naive or whatever, but I'll stick to it. I'll stick to it.
I'll be right there with you.
Yeah.
All right. So we're reaching the
Yeah.
end of our talk. So I wanted to ask you for yourself more as a writer. When you were early on in your creative writing career, what advice do you wish that you could have gotten at that point when you were just starting out?
Just quickly, I wish I'd been given the same advice that I was given by somebody when I was doing my doctorate in history. Same advice applies across the board. I think when I was out looking for jobs, I said to some professor where I was doing grad school, I said, "Oh my God, I don't know who's going to be interviewing me. I don't know what they're looking for. I don't know what they want. I don't know how to present myself." And he very calmly said, that's who he was, very calmly said, "Alice, just put your best self forward. You have no idea what's going on behind the scenes. You don't know who you're going to meet. So just be yourself and put yourself, your best self forward and see how it goes. And if it doesn't work, there's nothing you can do. You've still been yourself and hung on to your integrity." And I just think it was such wonderful advice. You can't game the system. Hopefully, as an artist, you don't want to game the system. Hopefully, you just do what you're good at, you do what you love, and you keep showing up. And it's so simplistic, but it's a cliche, but don't externalize your sense of self-worth. Don't seek it out in other people. Just try and love what you do and be good at it. And good things will follow at some point if you keep showing up. And I wish somebody had told me earlier, because I think I spent at least the first 6 or 7 years of trying to write, thinking about where am I going to publish and who approves of me and wanting people's approval. Now I'm just sort of like, you know what, I just got to keep showing up and doing what I love.
Yeah, that's a great piece of advice. I mean, I for me, I think what has really helped me in my writing recently is, a piece of advice that I got from a professor of mine, just, to start off writing what and that doesn't mean just writing from the perspective of people like you or in an environment that you're familiar with, but to just write from your own human experience, the basic human element that we all share and that on the minutia of life that we can all connect to.
Yeah, no, that's great advice, and hang on to that person as a mentor, because I mean it is fantastic. Just if you start with that, something that is meaningful to you and important to you, chances are you'll connect with people because your enthusiasm and your commitment to that topic will show on the page. I think it's essential.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, really, Caesura is all about that, just connecting with each other on a very, very basic human level, without all of you know, the politics or, the all the things that we really put emphasis on in the world, whether class or race, et cetera, just
Mhm.
the basics of our humanity.
Yeah,
No.
yeah.
Yeah, this story, I really, really loved it. First, second, third read, it just continues to surprise me and stay with me in so many ways. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, why read? What brought you to read? I know why submit with us? And how is this process, either subverted or met your expectations?
Yeah, yeah. No, I'm glad you're asking that, because first of all, I'm really grateful to Read Magazine, and I'm really grateful for, all the readers and editors, Helen Messervy, who's been great, and basically everyone who read the story and forwarded it to the judge. And I'll just say as an aside, it's funny because I'm landlocked in Arizona in the middle of the Sonoran Desert, but I think of myself very much as a West Coast writer. I mean, at this point, Arizona and California are merging more and more with all the cross migration. But basically, I've really become aware over the years writing how much people west of the Mississippi, let's just say, can get overlooked and not recognized as an important part of literary landscape in this country. And so I was just really excited to see Read Magazine, and to read about them before I submitted, and to know how long they've been around, how long they've been contributing to the literary culture. And it's really amazing. What is it, 1867, that the
Yeah.
magazine goes back.
California's oldest literary magazine.
Yeah, it's fabulous. And it was just really, it really made me happy because, again, I've become aware of the fact that there's so many well-established, MFA programs or literary agencies or conferences that take place east of the Mississippi, but yet there's this really vibrant culture here out in the West that gets overlooked. I mean, right in Tucson, we have Lydia Millett, who's just a huge writer, and Joy Williams, who lives about 2 miles from me. I wish I could say we hang out every day, but we don't. But, one of this country's greatest living writers lives in Tucson. And it's just really exciting, whenever I encounter a chance to really be part of something that feels like it's really keeping attention on the West Coast. And I also submitted to the contest specifically because of the judge. I mean, Collin Winnette, it was really amazing in his comments. He gave me great comments on the story, but I was really drawn to submit to the contest in the first place because he as a judge just didn't seem like one of the usual suspects, I'm going to say. I mean, I don't, again, I don't want to start off on a negative, but you see certain contest judges that keep appearing and it seems like they're professional contest judges. And I don't know what's in it for them. I'm not going to ask, but it means that a very limited number of people seem to have outsized influence on who gets selected or who gets showcased. And I was really glad to see somebody who's an indie author who published with $2 Radio, Soft Skull. I mean, some of the presses that are really doing innovative work and trying to showcase authors who aren't necessarily in the mainstream. And again, his own writing was intriguing to me. I do a lot of research when I submit to contests because the judge is ultimately going to make the decision. And if it's not a good fit, it's not a good fit. And just as a humorous aside, I once submitted to a contest and the judge was named late in the game. And it wasn't this story, it was something else. But it turns out she was a beauty queen who had written a lot of novels about beauty pageants. And, that's fine and all and great, but that's certainly not the kind of work I do. And, given the fees, you just, you want to be careful. And I was really excited when I read about the judge and then, really again, thinking about the West Coast kind of as a place that I've now made my home. It was really exciting to me to be selected by Reed. So thank you. I'm very grateful.
Well, we are so glad to have you, and I understand the sentiment you're expressing. To have a judge who is, not just, let's say, a professional judge, someone who only does that, but someone who is a part of the literary community and an active participant in it, writing, being there, and, offering their honest feedback and criticisms.
Yeah. Yeah, no, he was a really thoughtful reader. And, I've gone on to read his work. And it's a great thing because when you read about the judges, you can also start thinking, oh, I'd love to read their work. And I did read his novel Users, and it was about identity. So it just felt like a really good fit. So anyway, it's great. He was great. Everybody was great. And was glad to be part of this. And yeah. So thank you.
So I want everyone to know what's next for you. What can you talk about? What's going on next for Alice Hatcher? What have you got?
Yeah, thank you for asking. This is time when to really hang on to that advice I got in grad school because I'm now submitting my second novel to agents and scared out of my mind, as you can imagine. It's just a terrifying moment when you let go and you said, this project's done, and what does somebody else think about it? You're helpless at that point. And I literally just started sending it out, so I don't know what's going to happen this week. I just decided it's time to hit send. It's time to time to do this
Yeah.
and
I mean, is
stop
anything
fighting.
ever really done? I mean,
Yeah,
that's the question with writing. I mean, it's
yeah,
never really done, but you
yeah,
gotta make the choice. So,
yeah. So it's a novel set in Tucson, and I'll say no more because we're running out. But it's a novel set in Tucson. So again, I'm hoping to bring this conversation full circle. But let's hope that people in different parts of the country can recognize Tucson as an interesting place and want to read about it. Fingers crossed.
well, best of luck on that. So, where should people look for any news on where that's coming from?
Well, as soon as, if anything was to happen, they can go to the website and also reach out if they want to say hi. And that's alice-hatcher.com. So www.alicehatcher.com. And, I'm always interested to hear from people, and I will post any good news if it happens, and dare to dream.
Well, I can't wait to see what comes next for you, and I really hope to see that book because I
Yeah.
would love to see Tucson, Arizona through your eyes.
Thank you.
Yeah, this has been just a really great talk, and really hard in some places, but it's important to talk about the difficult things, the uncomfortable things. We learn from them and we grow from them. So I'm glad that, you could share this with me and share Caesura with the world in Read Magazine, issue 157. So I can't wait for people to read it for themselves. It's going to be great.
Yeah, well, thank you. And thank you to Read Magazine and all the editors. And I love what you're doing with the podcast. So I'll look forward to keeping up on the podcast as well.
Thank you again to our guest, Alice Hatcher. This has been In the Reads, the podcast of San Jose State University's Read Magazine, California's oldest literary journal. Find us on YouTube at In the Reads Podcast and readmag.org. Thanks for listening.